In this video, I'll cover the rules of Janggi, or Korean chess. Janggi is a game based off Xiangqi, or Chinese chess. And for those familiar with Xiangqi, you'll notice a lot of similarities right off the bat. And for that reason, I'll be comparing things to Xiangqi pretty often throughout this video. At the same time though, this game is very different from Xiangqi. In fact, there's only one piece that actually moves the same, which is the horse. So for anyone new to both, I wouldn't suggest learning both of these at the same time unless you're very familiar with one of them already, because the rule sets are so different that they could really easily confuse you. So let's start with the board and its basic differences from Xiangqi. Like Xiangqi, pieces are played on intersections, not squares. There are two 3x3 areas on each side called a palace, but unlike Xiangqi, the king or general in Janggi starts in the very middle, not in the back row. Xiangqi players will also notice that the river is gone. This implies that the pawn and elephant are no longer affected by the river, which I'll explain later. There is also one major difference in setup in that each player can choose their starting position. The other difference you might notice is that the shape and colors of each piece are different. In Xiangqi, pieces are red and black using circular discs. In Janggi, they are blue and red on octagonal discs. Pieces also have different sizes in Janggi. Blue is also called the Cho army, and could also be colored green in some sets, while red is also known as the Han army. Which side that moves first is also different, but there's one special event that happens at the beginning of the game. First, red, or Han, has the option to swap his horses and elephants however he wants. So for example, he could start them like this. Then blue, or Cho, has the option to do the same. So blue might also choose to swap. After that, blue starts the game. So this is the opposite of Xiangqi, where red starts the game. So that covers the board and start of the game. As with most types of chess, the goal is to checkmate the king. So it's to capture this guy. Unlike chess and Xiangqi, stalemate is impossible though, because in Janggi you can actually pass. So in real life you can pass by flipping your king. But to pass in Pi chess, all you have to do is either double click your king or hit the pass button. Alright, so with all the basics out of the way, let's go over the pieces. Also, I should note, in this video I'll be using internationalized pieces. There are plenty of sources of how to play using the original Chinese characters, but I figured I'd make it accessible to everyone. Okay, let's start with the king, also known as the general. The king is confined to the palace, so it can't go out here. That's illegal. It can only move in these 9 spots. And the way the king moves is it just follows the lines of the palace. So over here there are only 3 lines, as you can see, so it can only move 3 spaces. But over here there are multiple lines. So in the central position, the king has the most moves. Next to the king are the 2 guards, also known as advisors. These are also very different in Xiangqi in that they also move like the king. So again, they follow the lines of movement. Okay, the next piece is the chariot. And this is the most powerful piece in Janggi, just like in Xiangqi. It's the same as the Western Rook. So it just can move straight forwards, up, down, left, and right in a line. So very, very straightforward. But there is one difference, and this difference actually applies to multiple pieces. And it's something quite unique to Janggi, in that if a chariot is in the palace, it can also move straight along the lines of the palace. So specifically the diagonal lines. So it could actually move here. And if it starts over here, it can move like that. So actually a very deadly move is if you have 2 chariots together. If you manage to get your chariot to the center of the enemy palace, protected, that's a guaranteed checkmate. Okay, the next piece I want to talk about is the pawn or soldier. You have 5 of these to start off with. And as I mentioned before, there is no river in Janggi. So in Xiangqi, soldiers could only move one space forward until they cross the river, and at that point then they could start moving sideways as well. In Janggi, they can immediately start moving sideways. This makes them much stronger than their Xiangqi counterparts, and also they have an additional move, and again, it's the palace lines. So once your soldiers reach the enemy palace, they can also move one space along the diagonal. But again, they can only move forwards, so this pawn cannot go backwards, it can only move to these spots. Okay, the last of our straight moving pieces is the cannon. And to illustrate the cannon, I'm going to need to place a few pieces around here. So the cannon is also different than its Xiangqi counterpart in that in Xiangqi the cannon is kind of like a rook in that it can move straight, but to attack it needs to jump over a piece to capture one, like that. In Janggi, its movement and attack are the same, so in this position, this cannon cannot move left or down because there's nothing to jump over. It needs to jump over a piece in order to move somewhere. So its only valid options are these two spots because it has to jump over its pawn first to reach those spots. And then now that it's on this side, it has the options to go to any of these spots over here. So if I have two pawns over here, I can make a series of jumps. So for one move, I could go over here, and then the next move, I could go over there. And again, to attack, it's the same deal. You have to jump over another piece, so this pawn, in order to capture a piece beyond that. Because of this, the cannon is more restricted than in Xiangqi. Now there's also a couple additional rules with the cannon that I have to mention. First is that cannons cannot jump over other cannons. So this cannon over here cannot jump over here. This is illegal. Second, cannons cannot take other cannons. So even though there is a pawn over here in between these two cannons, the blue cannon cannot take the red cannon because cannons can't take cannons and cannons can't jump over cannons. And then finally, there is the same palace rule. So a cannon may use the diagonal lines of palace for movement, which is very rare, but if you have this situation over here, this cannon can jump over this pawn to move over there. Or in this case, this cannon actually attacks the enemy king, or puts the enemy king in check until the pawn just moves away, or the king moves away. Okay, the next piece is the horse, and as I mentioned before, this is exactly the same as in Xiangqi. So if you're not familiar with that, the horse is different than its Western chess counterpart, the knight. It overall makes the same movement, which is kind of moving two spaces forward and one to the side, like that. But unlike Western chess knights, the horse can be blocked. Let me just demonstrate first. The movement is like a Y shape, so you move forward, and then you can move further forward diagonally by one space. So going to the right, you have access to these two spots. To the left, these two spots. And then going down, you have access to these two spots. So as long as the piece is touching the horse, it blocks access to those spots over there. So, for example, another pawn over here would block access to these two spots, because the horse would have to go through that pawn in order to reach there. So of course there are situations where one horse is able to attack the other horse, but the other horse can't attack back because it's blocked. And then finally we have the elephant, which is radically different than its Xiangqi counterpart. It's a tricky piece for many new people. It has kind of awkward movement. So the way the elephant moves is it moves one space forward just like the horse, but then it moves two spaces diagonal, like that. So again, something like this. This is how it goes to the right side. This is how it goes down. And then finally going to the left. So again, it's like a bigger Y. And just like the horse, if you have a piece in the way, that actually blocks access to those endpoints. But on top of that, if you have a piece that's in the middle of the diagonal, then it also blocks the elephant. So the elephant is very easy to block. And because it's such a tricky piece, it might help just to play around and get a hang of its movement, just so you know what it feels like. So again, going like down here, and then over here, the elephant cannot move this way. So the elephant could move like over here, and then it could move like here. And just keep playing around with how you can get from one place to another. Just because it's a very tricky piece. Okay, so those are all the piece movements. Now let's finally talk about the rest of the rules, which are the endgame situations. I already mentioned that the main way to win the game is to checkmate the other king. But what about other conditions such as draws? Well, a draw could happen if both players agree to a draw, and the main way they can do that is blue passes, then red passes. So once you have 2 consecutive passes, the game is drawn. Now the other thing that can happen is something that will confuse a lot of Shangqi players, and that's when 2 kings face each other on an open file like this. In Shangqi, this is illegal. That's called the Flying Generals rule. But in Janggi, they have a Laughing Generals rule, or Bikjang. And so what Bikjang means is when you have 2 kings facing off each other, you have to remove this situation, otherwise accept a draw. So for example, if for some reason blue moved his king over here and created Bikjang, now red must either accept Bikjang or either move the king away or move another piece in between. So for example, something like that. So that's a simple way of describing Bikjang. There's also an additional rule in tournaments where there is no draw possible and there's always a winner. And so what happens is if Bikjang happens, then the game is decided on points. So for example, let me pull this back over here. Blue moves his king over here and red passes, which accepts Bikjang. Now the number of points each player has decides who's the victor. So how do you figure out the number of points? Well, each piece that you have on the board has a certain value. And let me just lay these out for you so you could see what the values are. Okay, so here are the values. As usual, the king is infinite, so it doesn't really have a point value. But chariots are worth 13 points. Cannons are worth 7 points. Horses are worth 5 points. Both elephants and guards are worth 3 points. And then finally, the soldiers are worth 2 points. Because blue goes first and has an advantage, red is given 1.5 points automatically at the start of the game. So with all pieces intact, like this, blue has 72 points and red has 73.5 points. And that can only go down throughout the game as pieces get captured. And because red has that 1.5 point advantage, there can never be a tie. For the rest of the video, I just want to touch upon notation very quickly, as well as very basic strategy to get you started. Janggi notation is very different than chess or shogi in that the coordinates are opposite. So in chess or shogi, it usually goes by file first, and then the rank. So for example, this over here might be called 1, 0. This last rank is called 0. But in Janggi, it's the opposite. So this king right now is on rank 9 and file 5. So this is a king on 9-5. So when you're following game notation, just keep that in mind that the file comes after the rank. Finally, some quick tips for beginners. As I mentioned with the elephant, make sure you're aware of its movements. It's very easy to get an elephant into a position where they can capture a piece and you might not even be aware of it. So for example, right here, this elephant is eyeing this chariot. So be very familiar with the movement, because if you don't, you'll very easily lose a piece. Second, there's a very strong inclination among Western chess players to push pawns. Pushing pawns is actually not a good idea in Janggi. Pawns are strong when they're touching each other from the sides. So for example, these two pawns are now supporting each other. It's very hard to kill one because the other pawn will just take it back. So in general, you want to keep your pawns paired, and if you're going to move them up, which you might do later in the game, then you want to keep them paired together. And because pawns can move sideways from the start, it's actually a good idea to do so. So for example, in this starting position, just by moving that pawn, you actually open up this chariot and let him have free reign in this file. So this kills two birds with one stone. Not only does it pair these two pawns together, it also opens up this chariot. And then finally, as you get into the rules a little bit further, you get to realize that there are certain positions that make more sense when you pair the pawns together. So for example, if blue swapped his horse and elephant over here, the elephant has the ability to jump into this line, and so that would make putting these two pawns together a good idea. And now from here, the elephant threatens multiple parts or multiple points on the enemy line, which puts it in a very good position. Now if you recall from the scoring, an elephant is only worth 3, while a soldier is worth 2 points. So if you somehow have a combination, so for example, this situation here where this elephant is attacking this soldier over here, this soldier retakes, and then you retake with another piece like a chariot. They've lost 2 soldiers, which is 4 points, and you've lost an elephant, which is 3 points. So a pair of soldiers is more valuable than an elephant. In the description, I'll put a link into a great series that'll go more into detail about starting positions and how to best position your pawns and make the best of your openings. If you're interested in Janggi, I would definitely give it a look. So that's it for the rules of Janggi. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please don't forget to like and subscribe.